The pounding at the door came like a jolt in the stillness. Samuel Price nearly dropped the mug he was rinsing, his heart leaping in his chest. It was almost 1 in the morning. No one came knocking at that hour, not here, not to him. His mind went instantly to the small bedroom down the short hall where his 8-year-old daughter, Amari, lay sleeping, her little nightlight throwing soft shapes across the wall. Every instinct in Samuel told him to keep that door closed. But the knock came again, faster, more urgent. He edged toward the door, bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. Through the peephole, he saw her, an elderly woman standing alone on his porch, clutching a handbag to her chest like it was her only lifeline. Her thin coat hung loosely from her shoulders, and her hair, soft, silver, and wild from the wind, framed a face etched with confusion and fear. Samuel opened the door just a little. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Her voice came out in a tremble, barely above a whisper. I think I'm lost. I don't know where I am, and I can't find my way home." Her eyes, clouded yet searching, met his, and something inside him softened. Still, caution stayed in his tone. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No. Just, tired. And so cold." The January air spilling in through the open door was sharp enough to sting his skin, and he knew without thinking that she wouldn't last long out there. He had seen plenty of hard nights in his life, but the way she stood there, shaking from more than just the weather, reminded him of his late grandmother, how vulnerable she had been in her last years. He stepped aside. "Come in, ma'am. We'll sort this out in the morning." She hesitated, her eyes flicking past him as though unsure she should cross that threshold. But when the wind picked up, she moved forward slowly, her steps careful. Samuel led her into the living room, a space that carried the quiet marks of struggle and love in equal measure. The couch was worn but clean, a thrift store lamp cast a warm glow, and a stack of Amari's crayons and coloring pages sat in a neat pile on the coffee table. "I'm Samuel," he said gently. "What's your name?" For a moment, she seemed to search for it, her brow knitting in concentration. Then she spoke. "Ruth. Ruth Chandler." He nodded. "Do you have any ID? Or maybe a phone number for someone we can call?" Ruth opened her handbag and began rummaging, pulling out a handkerchief, a church bulletin, and a pack of peppermint candies. Her movements grew slower until her hands stilled completely. "No. I had a wallet. I don't know where it went." Before Samuel could answer, a small voice floated from the hallway. "Daddy? Who are you talking to?" Amari stood there in her pink pajamas, hair a little mussed from sleep, eyes blinking in the low light. Samuel gave her a reassuring smile. "This is Miss Ruth. She's just going to stay with us tonight because she needs somewhere warm." Amari stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the older woman. Then, without a word, she disappeared into her bedroom and returned holding her favorite blanket, the soft purple one with the satin edges. She held it out with both hands. "Here. It's really warm." Ruth's lips trembled as she took it, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, sweetheart. You don't know how much this means." Samuel made tea for them both, and as they sat, Ruth shared fragments of her night, coming to the city to see her sister, missing her bus, getting turned around. But there were gaps, moments where her thoughts seemed to scatter, and her voice trailed off into silence. By the time Amari was nodding off against her father's side, Samuel decided it was time to settle in. "You can have the couch tonight, Miss Ruth. I'll grab you a pillow." Ruth's eyes met his, soft and wet with gratitude. "You didn't have to open your door to me. You don't even know me." Samuel gave her a faint, tired smile. "I know you needed help. That's all that matters tonight." As the lights dimmed and the house fell quiet, Samuel stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of the two souls now under his roof. He didn't know that this night, this single choice, was about to change all three of their lives in ways none of them could imagine. Morning came quietly, with a pale winter sun spilling weak light through the blinds. Samuel woke before Amari, as he always did, but this time there was a new awareness in the air, an extra presence in his home. The faint rustle of movement in the living room reminded him that Ruth was still here. He stepped out carefully, and found her standing by the window, her thin frame silhouetted against the glow. She was holding Amari's purple blanket like it was the most precious thing in the world, her fingers tracing the satin trim again and again. "You sleep okay?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice gentle. She turned to him slowly, offering a small smile. "It's been a long time since I felt that safe." The words caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being anyone's safe place, most days he barely kept himself together. Before he could answer, Amari padded in, hair a soft mess from sleep, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Good morning, Miss Ruth." Ruth's face lit up. "Good morning, sweet girl." Samuel made breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a few slices of apple. Ruth ate slowly, politely, as though trying not to take more than her share. When Amari chattered about school and her best friend's new puppy, Ruth listened intently, smiling in a way that made the little girl talk even more. After breakfast, Samuel asked, "Ruth, do you remember anything else about last night? Where you were headed?" Her brow furrowed. "I was visiting my sister." "Yes. She lives somewhere near a park." "A big park." She trailed off, looking frustrated. "I'm sorry. It's all fuzzy." Samuel could see the strain in her face, the way she fought to hold on to something slipping from her grasp. He thought about calling the police, but something in him hesitated. He didn't want her treated like just another lost old woman, shuffled into some system. "All right," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. But you're not going back out there in this cold until we know where you're going." She nodded, visibly relieved. The day passed quietly. While Samuel worked on his delivery schedule from the kitchen table, Ruth sat with Amari, helping her color. Samuel watched from a distance as Ruth carefully stayed within the lines, her hands steady, her voice soft when she praised Amari's work. It stirred something in him, memories of his own grandmother sitting beside him at the kitchen table, guiding his hand over letters in a workbook. Those were some of the few safe memories he had from his childhood. That night, as Amari got ready for bed, she tugged at his sleeve. "Can Miss Ruth stay again? Just for one more night?" Samuel glanced toward the living room, where Ruth sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. "We'll see, baby girl. We'll see." But the truth was, he wasn't ready to send her away either. When Amari was asleep, Samuel sat across from Ruth. "I'm going to try calling a few shelters tomorrow, see if they can help us track down your family. Do you have anyone else? Kids? Grandkids?" Her eyes flickered with something, pain, maybe regret. "I had a son. His name was Thomas." But, she looked down at her hands. "We haven't spoken in years." Samuel didn't push. He knew what it was like to have broken family ties, to live with words left unsaid. Later that night, when the house was still, Samuel heard soft crying from the couch. He stood in the hallway, unseen, listening to Ruth whispering a name, Thomas. Thomas, like she was praying for someone who might never come. And that's when Samuel knew. This wasn't just about finding her way home. It was about something deeper. Something lost long before she knocked on his door. What he didn't realize was that helping her might mean reopening wounds in his own life that he'd kept shut for years. The next morning, Samuel dropped Amari off at school, promising her that Miss Ruth would be there when she got home. The little girl skipped through the doors with a smile, clutching her lunchbox, but not before leaning down to hug Ruth tightly. Ruth held on for a beat longer than most people would, her eyes closing as though she was storing away the warmth. Back at the house, Samuel brewed coffee while Ruth sat at the table, quietly sipping tea. He had his phone out, scrolling through lists of shelters, assisted living facilities, and missing person reports. The city had too many names and too few answers. "Do you remember the name of the park?" Samuel asked gently. She shook her head. "I remember, swings. Big trees. Children laughing." Her voice was soft, almost distant. "But that could be anywhere." He tried another approach. "What about your sister's name?" Ruth frowned in concentration. "Helen, yes. Helen Winters. She always wore red lipstick, even when she was sick." It was the most detail Ruth had offered since she arrived, and Samuel clung to it. He began making calls, asking about a Helen Winters in the city, explaining the situation in careful terms. Each answer was the same: no record, no information, no match. By mid-afternoon, Samuel's voice was hoarse from repeating the story. Ruth sat beside him, her hands folded, watching him with something between gratitude and sorrow. "You don't have to do all this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do," he replied without looking up. "You showed up at my door. That means you're my responsibility until you're safe." Her eyes glistened. "You remind me of someone I loved very much." When he finally took a break, Ruth insisted on helping with dinner. She peeled potatoes at the counter while Samuel seasoned chicken. He noticed how her hands shook slightly, but she didn't complain. Instead, she hummed softly, an old hymn his grandmother used to sing. The smell of roasting chicken filled the kitchen by the time Amari came bounding in from school. She ran straight to Ruth, showing her a crayon drawing of a big house with 3 people in front, 2 adults and a child. "That's you, me, and Daddy," Amari explained proudly. "I drew it 'cause I want you to stay here forever." Samuel's chest tightened. He didn't want Amari getting too attached, but how could he not see the bond forming between them? Ruth knelt, pulling Amari into a gentle hug. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a very long time." That night, after Amari was asleep, Samuel sat with Ruth in the living room. The glow from the lamp cast soft shadows across her face. "Ruth," he began, "what happened between you and your son?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He didn't approve of the choices I made after his father died. I remarried too soon, maybe. We fought, and he stopped calling." Her voice cracked. "I haven't seen him in 12 years." Samuel leaned back, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought of his own father, how the man had walked out when Samuel was barely a teenager, leaving behind a silence that never quite healed. "I'm sorry," Samuel said. And he meant it. She met his eyes, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "Sometimes, the worst part isn't losing people. It's knowing they're still out there, living without you." Samuel didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how many people drift through life carrying regrets they never get to mend. And somewhere deep down, he made a decision: he wasn't just going to help Ruth find her sister. He was going to help her find peace. The next morning, Samuel woke with a quiet determination in his chest. He dropped Amari at school and came straight back to the house, where Ruth was sitting in the kitchen with a steaming mug of tea. She looked more rested, but there was still a fragility in her expression, as if she was afraid the world might swallow her up again at any moment. "I think I might have a way to find your sister," Samuel said, sliding his laptop onto the table. "It's a long shot, but I've been thinking, we could search voter records and property listings. If she's still in the state, something should come up." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mug. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Samuel met her gaze. "Then at least you'll know. And you can stop wondering." They sat side by side, combing through pages of names, addresses, and old public records. After nearly 2 hours of dead ends, Samuel's screen lit up with a name. Helen Winters, retired, age 78, address listed in Brookfield, about an hour's drive away. Ruth covered her mouth, her voice trembling. That could be her. Samuel leaned back in his chair. I can call first, or we can just go. Ruth shook her head firmly. If it's her. I want to see her face before she hears my name. Samuel nodded, grabbing his keys. The drive was quiet, the hum of the road filling the space between them. Samuel kept glancing at Ruth in the rearview mirror, her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the blur of passing trees. When they reached Brookfield, Samuel turned down a narrow street lined with modest, well-kept houses. They pulled up in front of a pale blue bungalow with flower pots on the porch. This is it, Samuel said softly. Ruth sat frozen for a moment, staring at the house as if it might disappear. Then, with a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out. Samuel followed a few paces behind, ready to catch her if her knees gave way. She knocked gently, and a moment later, the door opened. A woman stood there, thin, with silver hair pulled back neatly, and eyes the same deep brown as Ruth's. The moment her gaze landed on Ruth, her hand flew to her mouth. Ruth, the woman whispered, her voice breaking. Ruth's lips trembled. Helen. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Helen stepped forward, and the two sisters fell into each other's arms, sobbing openly on the porch. Samuel turned his face away, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. When they finally pulled apart, Helen touched Ruth's face like she couldn't believe she was real. I thought you were gone. I thought I'd never see you again. I was lost, Ruth whispered. But someone found me. She turned slightly, looking back at Samuel with a watery smile. Samuel cleared his throat. I just answered the door. Helen invited them inside, the air thick with unspoken memories. As they sat together, Helen began asking questions, where Ruth had been, what had happened. Ruth explained in halting sentences, but Samuel noticed she left out some of the more painful parts. Helen reached for Ruth's hand. You're home now. And you're not going anywhere again. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a quiet satisfaction he couldn't name. But as he stood to leave, Helen stopped him at the door. You brought my sister back to me. Please, don't disappear from her life. He promised he wouldn't. Over the next few weeks, Samuel found himself visiting Helen's home almost as often as Ruth did. At first, it was to check in on Ruth, making sure she was settling in and that her memory lapses weren't becoming more frequent. But slowly, the visits became something more, shared cups of coffee in Helen's kitchen, long talks on her porch while Ruth and Amari laughed in the garden. Amari had taken a special liking to Ruth. Every time they saw each other, Ruth would tell her little stories from her own childhood, stories about growing up with almost nothing but finding joy in the smallest things. Amari listened with wide eyes, as if Ruth was giving her a treasure no one else could. One afternoon, Helen pulled Samuel aside after Ruth had gone in to rest. I don't know if you realize what you've done, she said, her voice quiet but steady. You didn't just bring my sister home. You gave her back the will to live. She was fading. I could hear it in her voice when we spoke, even in the rare times I managed to reach her. But now, Helen's eyes filled with tears. Now she laughs again. She's herself again. Samuel didn't know what to say. He'd never thought of himself as someone who could change someone else's life. Most days, he barely felt like he was keeping his own life afloat. Helen touched his arm. And you, don't underestimate yourself. I know life hasn't been easy for you, raising Amari on your own. But you have more strength than most people ever will. Her words sat in his chest long after he left that day. He thought about them at night when he was doing the dishes, when he was folding Amari's clothes, when he was sitting in the quiet after she went to bed. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, there was another knock at his door. When Samuel opened it, Ruth stood there, rain beating on her coat, her eyes shining. "I know I should be with Helen," she said, her voice trembling, "but I didn't want to spend tonight anywhere else but here." Samuel stepped aside and let her in. Amari came running from the hallway, throwing her arms around Ruth. They sat together in the living room, the rain tapping softly against the windows. Ruth looked at Samuel and said, "I was lost once, Samuel. Completely. But you were the first person who didn't see me as a burden. You saw me as someone worth saving." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You were never a burden." She smiled. "Neither are you." That night, as Amari fell asleep on Ruth's shoulder and the storm rolled on outside, Samuel realized something he hadn't understood before: sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he was living. Winter crept into town slowly, bringing with it frosty mornings and the scent of wood smoke in the air. Samuel was doing his best to juggle extra work shifts and keeping up with Amari's school needs. He hadn't realized how much Ruth had quietly become a part of their lives until she stopped by less often. Helen had signed her up for a local senior center's activities, and Ruth was keeping busy. One cold afternoon, as Samuel sat at the kitchen table going through overdue bills, the phone rang. It was Helen. "Samuel," she began, her voice almost trembling with excitement, "I hope you don't mind, but I told someone about you. And, well, they want to meet you." He frowned. "Told someone about me?" "Yes," Helen continued. "My husband's cousin owns a small contracting business. He's looking for someone dependable, someone with heart, someone who doesn't just work for a paycheck but understands people. I thought of you." Samuel almost laughed. "Helen, I haven't worked in contracting since before Amari was born. I've been piecing together odd jobs for years. I don't even know if I'd remember half of what I used to do." Helen's voice softened. "Samuel, this isn't just about skill. It's about character. And you have more of it than most. Trust me, just meet him." Against his instincts, Samuel agreed. The following week, he found himself sitting across from a man named Thomas Grant, a tall, no-nonsense type with kind eyes that betrayed a hidden warmth. Helen had clearly told Thomas everything: about Ruth, about the night Samuel took her in, about the way he'd gone out of his way to reunite her with her family without expecting anything in return. "I need someone like that in my company," Thomas said simply. "Someone who shows up, not just because they're being paid, but because they care about the people they work with." The meeting ended with a job offer, steady hours, benefits, and enough pay that Samuel could finally start breathing instead of constantly treading water. When Samuel told Amari that night, she threw her arms around him. "Does that mean no more scary 'what if we can't pay the rent' talks?" she asked, her voice muffled in his shirt. He laughed, his chest aching in a good way. "That's exactly what it means, baby girl." But deep down, Samuel knew the job wasn't just a lifeline, it was proof that kindness had a way of circling back. A week later, Ruth showed up again, this time carrying a small, wrapped box. "This is for you," she said. Inside was a simple leather wallet, worn but still sturdy. "It belonged to my father," Ruth explained softly. "He always said a man's wallet should hold more than money, it should hold the reminders of who he is and what matters to him. You're the kind of man he would have liked." Samuel held the wallet in his hands, feeling the weight of her words. Sometimes, he realized, life doesn't give you grand gestures or perfect moments, it gives you unexpected knocks on the door. And if you open it, just once, it might change everything. Snow was falling thick outside, the kind that made streetlights glow in a hazy golden halo. Inside Samuel's apartment, the smell of baked cornbread filled the air. Amari was setting the table with mismatched plates, humming softly to herself, while Ruth sat in the armchair, knitting something in bright blue yarn. It had been months since that cold night Ruth had first appeared on his doorstep. In that time, she had gone from stranger to something Samuel could only describe as family. Helen often joked that Ruth had been adopted into their little unit, but Samuel knew the truth, it was the other way around. She had brought something into their lives they didn't even know they were missing. Dinner was simple, chili, cornbread, and apple slices, but it felt like a feast. They laughed easily, the warmth in the room chasing away the memory of winters past when Samuel would eat alone at the counter, wondering if life would ever feel full again. After dinner, Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "Samuel," she began, her voice soft, "I've been holding on to this for a while. But I think tonight's the right time." Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned and slightly faded, of a young black man in overalls, smiling in front of a small wooden house. On the back, in careful handwriting, it read, Isaiah Matthews, 1947. "That's my father," Ruth explained. "He worked with his hands, never made much money, but he never turned anyone away who needed help. He taught me that people remember kindness long after they forget what you gave them." Samuel turned the photo over slowly, his throat tight. "I think," Ruth continued, "that you're a lot like him." For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Amari broke it with a small, earnest voice. "Miss Ruth, you're like my grandma now, right?" Ruth's eyes brimmed with tears. "If you'll have me, sweetheart." Samuel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything, struggle, loss, hope, and the strange way strangers could become family without warning. Snow kept falling outside, blanketing the world in white. And in that little apartment, 3 people sat together, none of them sharing the same blood, yet bound by something far stronger. Sometimes, Samuel thought, the door you open for someone else ends up being the door that lets your own life change forever. And he knew, without question, he'd never close that door again.